Professor Futterer is here. I think I saw her. And we are going to transition into Flute. I am posting right now, everyone, a link to the band's website where Professor Futterer has linked handout materials for her presentation. And Karen, I think I have enabled that you can share a screen whenever you would like.
Okay.
Please take it away. Thank you for being with us. Karen.
Let me see if I can do this.
Perfect.
Are we there?
Yep.
No, we're not there yet, though. I have to move this. Okay. Okay, well, I just would love to echo the sentiments of all of you. That was just a wonderfully inspiring conversation there, and makes me delighted to follow that. And I'm talking about vibrato, which hopefully will enable those players to add some of the smaller rocks in the whole mix of their performing. I chose to discuss vibrato today because in essence, it is an essential part of, essential part of flute tone. And oftentimes it is not addressed early enough for students to really be able to utilize it, even in junior high and certainly by high school. And as a beginning band director, you know, you set the stage for all of the elements that hopefully are going to be then furthered. Vibrato a lot of times isn't taught as a beginning class because they feel that it's too sophisticated, or maybe they run out of time. Directors will run out of time. And the problem with that is that unless a student then starts private lessons, they're kind of left to learn that on their own, and a lot of times they don't necessarily learn it well. So my goal here is to provide at least some information about how to teach it and to actually encourage you all to get it going as soon as you possibly can. While vibrato is kind of like the latest fad in clothes or hairstyle. It changes with the era. It changes even within, you know, the particular piece you're playing. It's still an integral part of flute playing. And so obviously vibrato from the Baroque period is not going to be the same as 19th century vibrato. It also depends, so historically it changes. It also depends on the composer and the composer's wishes. This is probably most true in the 20th century, where composers have become very explicit about techniques and different effects. So we might find in our music something that says senza vibrato, don't play with any vibrato here, and they really mean it. And at the other time, they might want an exaggerated vibrato. And how we deal with that is going to depend on how flexible we can be with vibrato, including not using it at all. Also involved in this is the orchestration. And if you are playing with different groups or different instruments, that also has to then make an effect on what you're going to do with your vibrato. So those are technical aspects, mechanical aspects, but vibrato is also an intimate and a defining aspect of a musical being. It helps to define a flute player and a musician and how they choose to use vibrato, and how the vibrato sounds is really an individual aspect of the playing. So the first thing is, how do you develop it? And then what do you do with it to make it yours? I wrote down here that anybody who follows flute players and listens to them is well aware and can recognize James Galway almost immediately, because he has such a unique vibrato. And a lot of that we'll discuss as to why that's so unique here in a minute. So what is vibrato? Above all, vibrato really involves pitch change. And we have to create that movement of a pitch that goes sharp and flat, if at all possible, to create a usable and expressive vibrato. One of the most problematic things for students who learn vibrato on their own or try to learn it too quickly is that what they end up with is only a dynamic change, which is a minor part of vibrato, but certainly shouldn't be the only part of vibrato. So what happens if we end up with just a dynamic change is the, as I've written there, the dreaded nanny goat or machine gun vibrato, which is literally a glottal stop. And that is not a very expressive vibrato. It's generally one speed, generally no width, and it just kind of sounds nervous. And historically, you'd probably argue that's more of a tremolo than a vibrato. The third element in vibrato is timbre, the tone color. And this is more of a vicarious element. It really occurs out of the changes that you create in pitch, because as you manipulate that airspeed of greater intensity and greater relaxation, it will color the sound slightly. So ultimately, what we're really looking at is pitch change in vibrato. Why use vibrato? All of my teachers stressed the idea that an instrument ought to imitate a voice in so many respects. Voice is the most intimate, audible musical sound. Needless to say, there is nothing between you and your voice. And with that in mind, vibrato is a natural outgrowth of maturity in a singer, breathing, support, relaxation, all of those elements that create sort of an integral vibrato. As an instrumentalist, we have to work how to, or learn how to do that. And we tend to use certain techniques to get that started. But with that in mind, Joseph Mariano, who was the flute instructor at Eastman School of Music for many, many years, used to constantly remind me when we had lessons that really you wanted your instrument to be an extension of yourself, that you didn't really want to think of it as the flute out there, but literally part of your hands, part of your arms, and that the sound that you create with it should be an expression ultimately of your soul. I use the expression one with your instrument a lot with my students because I want them to get past that sense of sort of fighting the instrument or making the instrument do something. The hug your instrument, one of our daughters played cello, and in the first 6 months of her lessons, every time she'd go into a lesson, she was supposed to hug her cello. And there was a wonderful subliminal aspect to that in the idea that, well, the good part of it was it created good posture, but it also created a sense of that instrument as being something more, not just this wooden box that, you know, made interesting sounds. So through that idea of hugging the instrument, it also transferred some of the innermost parts of your soul into that instrument as well. And when you watch great players, they never look as though they are playing an instrument. They look one with that instrument. So that's the esoteric aspects of it all. Why use vibrato for technical aspects? For one thing, vibrato improves breathing and support. It is almost impossible to create a good vibrato, in fact it is, without proper breathing techniques, proper supporting techniques. And so there is a case to be made for starting that vibrato as early as possible, because it will encourage them to good basic breathing and support aspects of their playing. Vibrato also improves projection. When we talk about vibrato and we talk about projection on flute, we know it's one of the softest instruments, and it's always a little bit of a challenge to get projection when we really need big volume. Obviously, the core of the sound is most important, but what vibrato will often provide are the higher harmonics and overtones. And we always talk about this as the shimmer or the sparkle in the sound. So while you may not always even hear a specific core of sound coming through, you will hear that shimmer and get that flute, that characteristic flute sparkle. So that's a very important aspect of just nuts and bolts in playing. Another interesting aspect of this is that vibrato tends to really relax people, really open up. And if you play with the proper vibrato, most people will find it's very hard to get the same quality of sound and the same warmth and relaxation in their sound without vibrato. And so if you have a student play back to back with vibrato and without vibrato, there's probably going to be a difference in sound, and it's usually a better sound with the vibrato. And the last is very pragmatic. All students, all advanced flutists play with vibrato, but when you go in, send your students into region and junior high and senior high tryouts, you might notice on those sheets, and you've probably all judged, so you know that there is a category for musicality and also one for tone. Those scores are affected drastically by vibrato. So it is worth pushing this early so that students can end up with a better score on those tryout sheets. Before we get into actually exercises, I just want to mention a few little things about breathing. And the fact that probably you don't want to approach vibrato till students have a pretty good sense of developed breathing, good support, strong muscles, and a reasonable control of the lip aperture. The reason for that is that when you do play with vibrato, because that airstream is going to vacillate a little bit, it's kind of easy to get those muscles out of shape and a little too loose. So you want them to have some pretty good muscle in their lip. Usually by the second semester, most students should be ready to approach some vibrato. For breathing, it's two of my more go-to ideas. First of all, the first one is to always exhale before you inhale when possible. Most people, you know, they just say, take a breath. And so you may be half full of air, you may be full of air, but you take a breath, and it's very hard sometimes to get a good deep breath. And most people will find if they just simply exhale even a little bit of air before they inhale, they will have a completely different sense of breath in terms of being relaxed and in being able to take a good full breath. The other one I like to use just for fun is to tell them to breathe like Darth Vader, because when they make that noise, it drops their larynx and it pulls the tongue down a little bit, and it can be a little silly and fun for them. But it also puts everything into position so that when they're starting to play, that larynx is going to stay relaxed and down. Another common problem that I have encountered with some students is they really struggle with the idea that in is out and out is in. And that is that when they take in a deep breath, they want to pull their stomach in. And when they let the air out, they want to push it out. There are a couple of different breathing exercises somewhat associated with yoga. One of the easiest ones is simply to make them exhale all of their air, keeping good posture, keep their shoulders up, relaxed and up, their chest up, and just push all the air out that they can push out. And I will tell them that sometimes their stomach's going to feel like it hurts, and they might even feel like the muscles in their back around their waist might feel like they're going to cramp. But you want to get all that air out and then just simply open your mouth a reasonable amount, 1 to 2 fingers, and breathe in as quickly as possible. What we're looking for is to create somewhat of a vacuum in the lungs, and that air actually should, if they do this properly, the air actually should kind of flood in on its own, but there's no way they can do that without the stomach moving in when they exhale and then coming out. Slow breathing in and out for 10 counts. When I was taught to do this, it was in one side of the nose for 10 counts, out the other side of the nose for 10 counts. And that can be very instructive in terms of really filling up, because 10 counts or 10 seconds can be a long time. For some of these students, they want to take about 3 seconds to get it in and then push it all out. So those are just some suggestions if you have students that really struggle with getting that coordination. So I like to start vibrato without the flute. Especially with young students. I've had a lot of students that seem to feel this is weird, and they get silly about the whole thing and don't want to do it. So tried to make this as analytical as possible and as fun as possible. And I have them start on a syllable, ho, hu, ha. Ha is okay as well. It's not up there, but anyways, or just have them do some Santa Claus belly laughs, ho, ho, ho. Or you can use the merry old Land of Oz, ho, 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 ha, 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 and you know, that whole song. Something that gets their abdominal muscles working, and they feel their stomach moving so that they understand how deep in their body we're trying to get them to breathe. And then I will use that a little more. You can put a metronome on if you want, or you can just have them ho, 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 have them put their hand on their stomach. They should feel, and if they are struggling with pushing in, just literally have them use their hands to push their stomach in when they breathe out. Ho, ho, ho. And, you know, 1 or 2, it's just the idea of, with verbal aspects of this, we're just trying to get the sense of where this is coming from. Once they've done that, and you want them separated at first so that they get that sense of the motion too, of in and out and relaxing and tension. And then go and do the same exercise, only have them connect it. Ho, oh, oh, oh. You'll notice when I'm doing that, there is not a lot of dynamic change, perhaps a little, but more importantly, we're going to start to hear pitch change. Ho, oh, 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 oh. Sounds like a car that won't start. That is, again, to just then get them to realize that they're obviously not going to want to stop their air. I encourage students to do as much pitch change as they can. Obviously on voice, they can do all of the pitch change imaginable. On flute, probably you're going to get 1/4 of a step, or on really, really hard work, you might get a little more than that. I think that's one of the reasons Galway's vibrato is so unique, is that he sounds like he gets closer to a 1/2 step with his vibrato. And also encourage them to do rolling waves, not heart monitor, you know, up and down, really jabbing kind of waves. Because once you do that, you are probably getting into the glottal stop aspect of it. Ha, 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 ha. And that is, again, that's very uncontrollable, and it's not really too pleasant. You may want to use it for a special effect, but it's not really what you're looking for. Yodeling. is a great way to get a feeling of what's going to happen in the throat and in sometimes even the back of the tongue. If you watch singers, sometimes their tongue will be flopping away in their mouth, but we don't necessarily do that. But certainly the throat area and the upper chest is going to be moving. And so again, just something fun and silly to recognize all of the parts that might move when you are using vibrato. So the last thing I do before I add the flute in is to actually do all of this on just air. So we take away the vocal aspect of it and just do air. I think I can do this so you can hear it. And I encourage students to use quite a bit of air just because that usually makes them breathe better and think about breathing deeply. And again, you can hear the waves in doing that. There is going to also, one of the things with doing this is you can put your hands on your throat and feel the vibration of, and the expansion and contraction in your throat area where your vocal cords are, but also just where that air is going through at different speeds. What's important here is to remember that while you're feeling all that up in here, it is the abdominal push that is still creating the vibrato. And you have two parts to that. You've got your lower abdominal muscles, which ultimately push in, and then you've got your upper ones in your solar plexus. I'm kind of general about this and just say sort of above the belly button and below the belly button. Those muscles above need to stay out and they need to push out. So you actually have this two-part element going on there. The lower muscles are pushing in, the upper ones are staying out as long as possible to allow that diaphragm to move up and to get the last bits out of air. If you collapse the solar plexus area, the upper muscles, that's where you see a lot of chest sinking, but you actually trap the air too. So you want to make sure they're still really breathing well. So after all of that, then we do start with the head joint. And the reason I start with the head joint is it's the easiest and freest way to get vibrato working with the flute. The shorter the tube, the more flexible the pitches, the wilder the pitches. Most flute players will say, you know, you go really sharp on C's and C sharps because the tube is short. But the truth of the matter is you can go just as flat. And I've had students that actually worry so much about going sharp that they end up flat on those notes. So the head joint's even shorter, better way to start. And when you do this, the things you're listening for are the same things you were listening for on these previous exercises. You want evenly spaced waves. You want equal width of pitch change. And you really want to shoot for that up and sharp and flat pitch change. While we don't ever want to really measure vibrato in performance unless it's called for, we have to start with that because especially with those young students, they need more than just to say, well, just wiggle the sound. They probably will be helped much more by giving some more specific time limits and directions. So we don't want a force sound. If you hear a force sound, they're probably pushing from just their throat and not from their abdominal area. If you hear grunting, you know that that's in their throat, and we don't want that. So when we do this, and some students, because they've been taught to tongue, will just start trying to put tongue into this exercise. So usually what I do is I start with them just, play some air vibrato and then put it to the flute. And don't be in a hurry to make them go fast with this. What we're really looking for is that wavy pitch. Now, once you get to that point where they're doing that pretty well, you can turn the metronome on. Most people agree on 60 as a starting point. Have them pulse 1 wave at 60, and maybe go up to 2 or 3 and 4. The big issue there is don't have them go faster than they can control that pitch change and the evenness. If they start, you know, well, that's not really productive. So we want to keep it at a steady pace. And as I said, go to 2, then to 3, and then to 4 if they can do that. Somewhere around 3 and 4, they're gonna, if they're using only the lower abdominal area and they're doing wide pushes, they're probably going to end up getting into trouble controlling it. And at that point in time, the vibrato has to climb. The abdominal area, the solar plexus, they're going to stay stationary in good breathing posture, which is, of course, the lower ones eventually going in, the solar plexus staying out, and then they're going to start to feel change in their upper chest and in their throat. And they have to move it up into that area for that sense of pulsation, because you just can't get to 5 and 6 using your abdominal muscles. Anybody who's ever tried that knows how silly that is and impossible it is. You just can't move those abdominal muscles that fast. So that's the next step. And if they lose that support of the abdominal muscles as they go faster, well, going to struggle with that, but I can do it better singing it. So it's the ha, you know, it's old Tiny Tim and Tiptoe Through the Tulips, if you've ever heard that wonderful song. So at any rate, we're listening for that pitch change. We're really avoiding the sharp jabs of sound. If they struggle with that, back them up or have them do just air vibrato, so that they make sure they are doing this in the proper way. Right? If you don't hear pitch change, you know it's not correct in terms of what they're doing. We actually want to get as wide a vibrato as possible. As I mentioned, we don't have the unlimited ability to change pitch going flat and sharp. We really actually have some pretty finite edges on that. And we really want them to get as much pitch change as possible, because it's going to decrease as the vibrato goes faster. And we can lose it altogether, and we don't want to do that. We want to keep as much as possible. So these exercises, I've already started some of them here, but one of the most common ones that I use is simply to, wait a minute, I missed one somewhere. Going back here. So with this one, I'm going to put the metronome on so you can just hear what I do with this. And this is on 60. And like I said, you got to stop them when they get out of control with it. But and just have them work it up, and that's not going to happen overnight. You may not get past 4 for a long time, but the important thing is not to lose your pitch change in that. All right, this other exercise probably is good for students that are really struggling with keeping that pitch change. It ends up in the same place. You simply put the metronome on 60, start with triplets, or you can start slower than that. You know, if you want to go down to 40 to get them doing this, but that's fine. But so whatever's convenient and works for them. And then you just keep working it up. I'm not going to even mess with that, but you get the idea. You can go up, you know, incrementally, 60 to 63 to 66, or if they're doing pretty good, you might try going from 60 to 63, or I mean, excuse me, 60 to 66. Probably as you get closer to 120, you're going to want to go up a lot more, you know, probably one mark at a time on a old, you know, rated metronome. Maybe you're only going to go literally from 100 to 101 if they're struggling with it. But those are just two different ways to work with it. And if you're working with them in a band room on that 5 minutes a day, they're going to be picking it up, and you will have some pretty sophisticated sounds pretty quickly. So we have to start with those abdominal. This is somewhat reiterating what we're talking about, but ultimately we have to have that good support, and then we're going to feel that faster vibrato up in the upper chest and the throat. Once you've done a fair amount with the head joint, you know, and you're going to just make this call when they seem to be really doing well with this, then you add the body in. Start with your left hand notes. Start with C and C sharp, because those are your shortest notes. They will be the easiest to produce vibrato and the most flexible. And then just work down the left hand and into the right hand, because if you start on, say, A for D, especially something like D, it's very hard to produce that vibrato with all those fingers down. The tube is long and it is not as flexible. So it's good to just kind of work down the flute. Should practice it every day, because it is a technical exercise, just like learning to play fast scales. All right, so how do we use vibrato? These are in general, the higher the pitch, the faster the vibrato should be. The lower the note, or the lower the pitch, generally the slower it will be, within reason. Obviously, you don't want to get, that is not ever usable vibrato. Probably 4 to 6 pulses per second is within the usable range. So, but it just sounds very funny sometimes to hear low notes with real fast vibrato. Slow pieces probably are going to involve a slower vibrato than perhaps what you might use in a fast piece or at a moment of real intensity. And that's the next part of this. Then the intensity in the musical line also should create variety. And this is where personal taste comes in to some extent, for sure. Lastly, vibrato does help project a sound. And if you are really struggling to get more sound out of your flutes, adding that vibrato will help. It also can help intonation, simply because through vibrato, you're not trying to tune just pure notes, and that's kind of difficult. So, or can be anyway. So it can be helpful if you're struggling with that in your section. Okay, so again, for the best projection, we want to work with maximum width or pitch change. This exercise I have used many times with students, because they will come in with a nice vibrato that sounds great, right? From their lips to the stand. And then beyond that, it's hardly even there. And so one of the things that is, I don't know if we can do this right now, but it's maybe if we ever can not have to social distance, is to have a student stand right next to a player and listen to what the tone and the vibrato sound like right there, almost as if they're in their body. And then have them walk away as far as possible. Obviously, the farther the better. And notice what the differences are in terms of the decay of the vibrato. And also, this is a great exercise for understanding the differences in tone quality up close and at a distance. Typically, a tone might sound pretty airy up close, and then you get at a certain distance and all of a sudden it sounds very full. Sometimes a very clear sound up close will sound very hollow and almost thin at a distance. So these are great exercises in developing listening and understanding why they need that really big, wide vibrato. One other thing about vibrato is, and I already mentioned this a little bit, but because vibrato tends to cause more relaxation, really, And you do use this sort of relaxed and intense airstream, it's very important to remind those students not to let their aperture go. Typically that upper lip needs to be a little firmer and make sure it doesn't get pushed out with the air. So just have to kind of watch for that. And if you notice their tone is all of a sudden getting fuzzy, have them start with a straight tone, go into the vibrato, and make sure they don't change their embouchure. So vibrato and expression. While vibrato should not ever be controlled or measured, it doesn't mean that you don't think about how you're going to use vibrato. It isn't something you just kind of like, oh, I vibrato in my tone. You do have to think about it in terms of width, in terms of speed, and just what the circumstances are. One of the habits that many students develop with vibrato is what I call the on-off technique. And I do make my students play vibrato with in scales, and they will do the wonderful la, and you can even hear in just my singing the difference in tone to pull that vibrato back and then open it up again. It's a very annoying habit. It's very unconscious. Mariano used to talk about the fact that it's like a driver with a foot on the gas and the pedal, and you're always kind of going back and forth. He always used to say, you need to drive like you have an egg under your foot and the gas pedal. I assume he must have seen my driving at some point, but at any rate, it isn't a very pleasant effect, and it certainly isn't a very musical effect. So if they're prone to that and you're struggling with it, then at least have them do something like ya, where they at least change the speed so that when they turn the vibrato on, it's not just one vibrato. The other aspect of playing expressively, and I know that our directors there were somewhat talking about this with balance and blend. You really have to always be thinking about what instruments you are playing with. And also the situation. Is it a solo or a soli section? Is it lightly scored? What are the instruments that you're playing with? And so you've got to be aware of how to use your vibrato and whether you should use vibrato. Most instruments use vibrato regularly. French horn and clarinet do not, although they can do it. And when you play with those instruments especially, you want to take note of whether or not it's appropriate to use vibrato on flute. It isn't always that, oh, those instruments don't have vibrato, therefore I shouldn't. It really depends on the musical situation. And that is a judgment call maybe you as a director make with your students. And hopefully at some point they begin to think about that as well. So you have to take into account those circumstances when you are using vibrato. There is a lot of discussion about vibrato on fast notes. And some people will say, never use vibrato on fast notes. And others will say, like me, I think it's kind of cool. But again, you have to be very conscientious of the situation. The biggest argument for using it is that it is hard sometimes to feel rhythm for players that are trying to play with that flute player because there seems to be no sense of a beat and pulse. So if you're in conjunction, say you're playing a whole bunch of scales and you're in with the whole flute section and the whole clarinet section, you are not going to want to put vibrato on that because that will really probably create some chaos. On the other hand, if it's a solo passage and you want intensity and projection and excitement, then using vibrato on fast notes is really the way to go. And students will find this very difficult because you're not really hearing vibrato per se. What you are hearing is the energy and sparkle that is created by adding that vibrato in. So it really changes the whole musical aspect of it if you put it on there or add the vibrato in on fast notes. Students don't like to do this. It's really hard, but once they get the hang of it, it is another technique that we should have in our bag of tricks. So how to practice vibrato once you're into the technical, mechanical aspects, once you get past just the exercises. By the way, most flute players will practice vibrato and do exercises every day. It is a use it or lose it, and those muscles slow down and you forget exactly how they work, and you will lose that flexibility just like you will with double tonguing. So practicing scales, fast and slow speeds, practice with vibrato on every note, and trying to make that connection without a break, a seamless connection. You don't want ditches and gullies between notes. You want it to be a steady stream. And with that in mind, and this is what's difficult, is that you have to divorce your air and your vibrato from your fingers and from the motion of the notes. They are not connected, and that's tricky. When you do scales, you can, if they're working with slow scales because they're young kids, then have them pulse do 4 pulses of vibrato on each note. Gives them something to think about rather than rushing and dragging and wanting to go faster or how slow they're going. So, or, 3 pulses or whatever, but have them repeat the vibrato on each note. As they get faster, then obviously you can change that vibrato for each note. Long tones, somewhere in here, there are going to be some downloads for long tone exercises and vibrato exercises. The long tone exercise that I'm using in there is the timeless Marcel Moïse, somewhat modified, just simplified as well, all it is. But these are exercises using a chromatic scale, playing long tones, trying to build the muscle in the lip, but also being aware of the tone quality in with vibrato and the tone quality without vibrato. Most students are going to actually end up with a better sound with vibrato. And I usually then will have students play vibrato first, go back and repeat that one measure of the exercise without vibrato, trying to create as close to the same sound as possible. And that can be trickier than you think. But it makes them aware of their vibrato, their breathing and their relaxation. So it's a great exercise for that. If they actually sound better on a straight tone, then reverse it and have them do the straight tone first. And volume is one of the things that you will notice probably a big difference with when you do the straight tone versus the vibrato. One other thing that has to be worked on is what I call the seasick effect. And this is in addition to the on-off, which also can get pretty seasick sounding, this is the habit of starting a note without vibrato because they're not secure, and then adding the vibrato in halfway through the note. And sometimes that's a nice effect, but when it happens on every note, it gets really seasick sounding, and it really has no ability to carry a music line. It's again the brake and the gas pedal going at the same time, and it's like you're pretending, yeah, I'm really going to go somewhere with this line. No, wait a minute, I'm pulling it back. No vibrato on this note. So that is another exercise or another aspect of vibrato to be conscientious about. And it really has to do with that idea of divorcing the air and the vibrato from the fingers and the pitch, if you will. Slow pieces. The following exercises are designed to kind of work on some of those problems we just talked about. And slow pieces are where vibrato is going to be most apparent, and in tryouts and so on and so forth, this is the place where you will probably notice vibrato the most. So what I tend to do is, and again, there's lots of dispute on this, but I tend to practice pieces without any vibrato at all. Make them play through even just a phrase. Don't get carried away because then they'll forget what they're doing. But just take a small phrase, have them play that without any vibrato, but connecting the notes to make a beautiful phrase. Use dynamics, use color, but no vibrato. I have friends who literally have to record themselves doing this because they have such a hard time turning the vibrato off, and I'm one of them. But at any rate, if they can do that, then they begin to understand the phrase, and then they also begin to understand where they are liable to just sort of casually turn vibrato on and casually turn it off. So once they kind of get there, then go back and have them play the whole piece with nonstop vibrato, which is equally hard, and especially when you are trying to connect between notes. If they can't, they will find this very frustrating because they really have to stay open and relaxed and do minimal amounts of changes. But again, you don't want them to stop the vibrato at all. Now, you're never going to do either of these, hopefully, but you are now ready as a performer. You're aware of what it feels like with vibrato, where your tendencies are, and you're now ready to make musical choices as to how to use that vibrato. And that being said, how to use speed and width of that vibrato in addition to create the most expressive playing you can. Okay, I have, we're just about done here, which is good. I have a public YouTube site. If you go to Karen Futterer and you will look for a playlist called Vibrato. I have, I think, about 13 or 14 examples on there. They vary from obviously flute playing to some vocalists and a number of string players. I think that may be all I have on there. The vocal is a no-brainer because clearly that is the way we produce vibrato in essence on flute. And so hearing how these singers use vibrato in terms of width and in terms of speed and when they use it. And one of the ones I put on there is an aria from Norma called Costa Diva with Anna Netrebko. The opening of that is a huge flute solo, and then the singer comes in and repeats the melody. And it's very interesting to hear that. There are a number of Galway vibrato examples. I highly encourage you to start with Oh Danny Boy. When you're listening to these, if you aren't, well, just that's a great one to start with. The string examples I've put on there are also equally interesting because the one neat thing about strings that we don't have with flute and we don't have with voice is that we can see what they do. And so you can watch their finger vibrate up and down and create a variety of pitch, sharp and flat. You can also watch how fast and how slow and how much they change the speed of that vibrato through the use of their finger. And some of them, you can watch them go up that scale passage and maintain, in essence, the motion of vibrato, even when they're doing a scale passage, some of them pretty quickly. So these are exercises, hopefully, that can help a student hear why they want to use vibrato and how varied it can be. There are also just some very beautiful pieces. Most of them are slow. I think they may all be slow. No, most of them are, just because that allows students to hear that vibrato a little bit more. Okay, so vibrato taught the old way. Traditional teaching of vibrato was simply just listen to others and imitate them. Some students will instinctively do this, but most of them, you should start with the exercises so that they can get the proper breathing techniques going to start with. It is the hardest thing on the planet to change a student who has learned to go ah on every note. It is so hard. You literally have to shut off the vibrato and start them all over, and they are so frustrated by that. So there is an advantage. That's why I've given you the YouTube videos to listen to, but also it's just so critical to get them started correctly on this. So experiment, try putting it into the beginner classes and see what you come up with. There are these handout materials also. They have, I threw this one in on alternate high fingerings because, as we all know, you can get pretty close on high notes, but a lot of times it's just impossible to bring those pitches down. Please don't use those with junior high students because they're liable to learn all those fingerings and think they're right, and we don't want that. So they need to learn the correct fingerings first. The long tones and then suggestions on playing those long tones. I've tried to give you information there. The what is vibrato and who for vibrato, those are just pictorial sheets for the most part that kind of help to get you started on vibrato. So I think that is it. And I didn't leave any time much for questions, but if anybody has any.
Yeah, we have a few minutes. Are there any questions from anyone?
You're vibratoed out.
Yeah. To clarify, all those handouts, thank you, Karen. A beautiful presentation and fantastic handouts. I was just kind of clicking through on the site myself, are all at the website, linked in the chat, atu.edu/bands under resources for educators. So, and looks like Kendall posted the ABA session invites went out, so your email inboxes are getting a little fuller, everybody. So one more chance if there are any questions. If not, I'm sure everyone knows how to get in touch with Professor Futterer. I bet her email addresses are in the materials. If not, she's easy to find at atu.edu as well. And I know she'd be happy to talk with you and visit with your students sometime. Have her come on in, as she said, maybe post social distancing time or post COVID, when that will be someday. We're going to keep the faith. And thanks again, Karen, and everybody else for being with us today. I'll see you in some ABA sessions, I'm sure, the next couple of days. And next Tuesday is our final one of these, which the first hour is an ASBOA hour. And originally, Mrs. Reynolds was going to do an adjudication workshop. She and I have spent a little time over the phone yesterday, and due to current events, that first hour may be a roundtable of band directors discussing virtual teaching concepts and ideas, since that is likely to be a reality for us in the short and not so short term. So that first hour may pivot to be a band director panel of virtual instruction techniques. And the second hour is our final instrument masterclass with Professor Parker. And it's going to be a swing drum set clinic, a drum set masterclass oriented towards some of the jazz aspect of what we do. So hope to see you next Tuesday. And before that, thanks again, Karen. Thank you, everybody. Be safe. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.